A well-constructed piece of photojournalism is assembled from several different types of photographs. The wide-angle shot, for example, is very useful to set the location and tone for a story. An extreme close-up is very useful for establishing an emotional connection between the reader and the subject of the story. A very useful type of photograph in this mix is the environmental portrait. A well-constructed piece of photojournalism is made up of several different types of photographs. The wide-angle establishing shot, for example, is very useful for setting the location of a story. The extreme close-up is a very useful way of building an emotional relationship between the reader and the subject of the story. The pace and the power of a photojournalistic story comes from the mix of types of photographs that we build into the edit. A very useful kind of image in this mix is the environmental portrait. This type of photograph brings a person and their surroundings together in one frame to create a sense of who and what they are. The surroundings might have something to do with their identity, like, for example, where they live or where they work, or it might be a much more general kind of surrounding that you use simply to create a mood against which you want to introduce the person that you're photographing. In this lesson, we'll take a look at the preparation that's required for taking an environmental portrait, and we'll also look at some of the choices that you face in taking this kind of photograph. We'll examine the idea of the environmental portrait by taking a look at photographs that I took on a story about the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Vietnam in 1990. Now, it's important that we also fall back on the lesson about composition when we think about the environmental portrait. This kind of photograph is all about elements of composition, the language of composition. You'll understand when you look at the environmental portrait what its relationship to composition is. This kind of photograph uses a person's surroundings to tell us more about that person. Sometimes the environment against which we photograph this person is directly connected to who they are. It's that person's home, it's where they work, it's somewhere in that person's community. The key to getting environmental portrait photography right is finding a good balance between your subject and their background. Remember that the person is still the focus of your shot, and the surroundings, the environment against which you photograph them, is just a way of giving context to their personality and to their life. This photograph shows two Buddhist monks peering out the door of a Buddhist temple shortly before prayers began. They're sizing up the audience to make sure that it's large enough and worthwhile enough to get the proceedings going. Without actually having met them, I felt that this was a marvelous environmental portrait that set into context who these two people are and what it is that they did for a living. This is a portrait of a Montagnard tribesman who lives up in the highlands in central Vietnam. And he collects spent artillery shells left over from the Vietnam War and sells them as scrap metal. And I thought this particular construction was a marvelous way of introducing him and what it is that he does for a living. This photograph was taken in the tunnels of Cu Chi, the tunnels on the outskirts of Saigon that the North Vietnamese dug during the Vietnam War as a way of funneling troops and material into Saigon. The person sitting at the end of the table is one of the engineers who dug this tunnel system. This environmental portrait actually falls back on one of the ideas that we discussed in a previous lesson. The composition here gets its power from the idea of leading lines. The bamboo slats on the table in this tunnel dining room lead us directly to the engineer who dug this tunnel, who's sitting at the end of the table. In this environmental portrait of the young schoolgirl in Hanoi, I wanted to construct the frame in such a way that it gave some political context to her life in Vietnam. We see her in the foreground, and in the background is Ho Chi Minh's tomb, looming almost larger than life, and is clearly a huge presence both in the photograph and in her life. This is one of those photographs that falls into your lap occasionally as a photojournalist that really makes the whole profession very worthwhile. It's a very personal kind of photograph, and yet it stands on its own legs as a legitimate exercise in environmental portraiture. The man in the center of the photograph is actually my driver, and we've pulled into a roadside food stand on Highway 1 as we were driving south from Hanoi to Saigon. It was a rainy, overcast day, which gives the gritty feeling to the background in the frame, and he was just waiting for me to finish lunch and come back to the car. And as I approached the car, this is exactly what I saw. I lifted up my camera and exposed a frame. It could be anybody, anywhere in Vietnam. The fact that I have a personal connection with him is almost irrelevant. This is an example of an environmental portrait which doesn't rely on any sort of background to give context to the image. Quite the contrary. Very often you can use a neutral background in your environmental portrait to keep the viewer's attention focused solidly on the person that you're photographing. In this case, this is a wise old Vietnamese gentleman who's got an amazing face, and I didn't want anything in the background to distract the viewer's attention from looking very, very closely at this person's face. It's important to understand that the environmental portrait is driven chiefly by the rules of composition, and you will be able to employ the skills that you learned in the previous lesson about composition in this exercise. For this assignment, I'd like you to photograph 6 people in a carefully constructed environmental portrait that shows clearly what these people do for a living. Remember that each of these photographs has to work on 2 levels. It must very clearly establish their identity through what they do for a living, and at the same time, it also must engage the viewer with the personality of the person that you're photographing.